She never imagined that the hardest blow of her life would come in the form of an old envelope hidden among forgotten papers. Emily Whitaker, a 34-year-old woman, had been carrying the weight of her family on her shoulders for over a decade. She worked as an administrative coordinator at a public school, and since she began earning her own money, she was the one who bailed out the mortgage on the house when her parents almost lost it in 2015, the one who covered her hypertensive father's medications, and the one who paid for her mother's new glasses whenever her eyesight failed her. She contributed a fixed allowance every month, without fail. She did it out of love, without expecting applause. But that afternoon, while organizing the files on the old dresser of her father, asleep in front of the television, she found an envelope with her name on it. She opened it without thinking. It was a copy of the will. A few cold, legal lines that would change the way she saw everything she had lived through. The house, the car, the savings, even grandma's antique jewelry. Everything was destined exclusively for her younger sister, Megan. The same Megan who for years had been an unstable whirlwind, jumping from job to job, using her parents' money for spas and trips, and disappearing without warning when things got tough. There wasn't a single clause in her favor in the document, just a generic line. "We leave our love and gratitude to both daughters." Emily reread that passage, her eyes widening, searching for some mistake, an addendum, something to vindicate her. But there was nothing. She was invisible to those she had protected the most. Everything she had sacrificed, all the life she had put on hold for them, seemed to have been worthless. In that instant, the family house stopped feeling like home. That night, she said nothing. She put the envelope in her purse, made dinner as usual, and sat across the table from her parents, feigning a calm that burned inside. Her mother talked about a new neighbor, and her father complained about the rising gas bill as if nothing had changed. But for Emily, everything had. Every word they spoke felt like a pang. She watched as her mother served Megan's favorite dessert, even though she hadn't even lived there for months, and as her father laughed at an old VHS video of the two girls, pausing just as Megan made a funny face. Emily was there too, in that recording, silent in the background, holding her sister's arm to keep her from falling, just like in real life. That image haunted her all night. She couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in bed, replaying every time she'd said yes, when she could have said no. She remembered when Megan asked her for money to start over in another city, and she lent it, not knowing she'd never get it back. Or when her mother would tell her, "You're the strong one, your sister needs more support," as if that justified the constant imbalance. Emily grew up believing that being useful was the way to deserve affection. But now, with that testament in her purse, the truth hit her hard. No matter how much she'd given, how much she'd endured, it was never enough to be seen as a daughter worthy of trust, of a legacy, of memory. She felt she'd been merely a functional tool in the emotional structure of a family that never considered giving back what she'd built. The next morning, Emily made the coffee as usual, but this time she didn't pour it into the usual cup. She left it on the counter, without sugar, without kind notes, without the small gestures she had cultivated over the years. She watched her parents from the kitchen, her mother flipping through a catalogue for new curtains, and her father reading the newspaper with the glasses she had bought him. Nothing seemed out of place to them, and that contrast hurt her more than any argument. There was no open betrayal, no yelling or insults. There was only a structural, learned, normalized indifference. A form of forgetfulness that camouflaged itself in the mundane. That day, for the first time in a long time, Emily left for work without leaving lunch ready, without making the beds, without making sure everything was in order. And no one noticed. At the office, she tried to focus on her reports, deadlines, and pending messages, but it all seemed absurd. She'd spent her life putting off her own projects. She'd turned down a master's degree in another city to stay close to her parents. Ended relationships that didn't fit with her family routine, and never took vacations longer than a long weekend. She always believed that sacrifice brought rewards, but now she understood there was no guarantee of that. Her colleagues noticed her distraction, but no one asked anything. She just nodded, said, "I'm tired," and looked at the will again and again in her mind. She didn't know what was more painful, the content of the document or the normalcy with which everyone around her carried on as if nothing had happened. That night she decided not to go straight home. She wandered aimlessly through the streets of her neighborhood, as if searching for a version of herself she'd lost amid so much responsibility for others. She ended up sitting in a quiet square, where the only sound was the crunch of dry leaves under the footsteps of passers-by. On that cold bench, with her purse resting on her knees, Emily checked her phone for a file she'd almost forgotten, a draft of her scholarship. Application to study educational administration in Spain. She'd written it 5 years ago and never sent it. She read it as if it was someone else, admiring that brave, determined voice who had remained silent to care for others. She wondered what would have happened if she'd had the courage to prioritize herself then, and she asked herself this not with guilt, but with a gentle but persistent anger, the kind that arises when you understand too late what a younger version of yourself tried to defend. When she returned home, the television was still on, dinner was served for one, and the same feeling of invisibility hung in the air. Her mother had left a note on the table. "Remember, the gas man is coming tomorrow. Stay home just in case." Not a, "Where were you?" Not a, "Are you okay?" Just an instruction. An emotionless order. Emily read it softly, feeling something inside her begin to crack, not with sadness, but with an uncomfortable clarity. This house wasn't hers. It never had been. There were no portraits of her on the mantelpieces, no diplomas hanging, no stories told aloud about her accomplishments. She was a functioning ghost, present to serve, but never to belong. That night, for the first time, she understood that perhaps the problem wasn't that her parents didn't value her, but that she had accepted that role for too long without asking for anything in return. The next day, as she made coffee for herself, this time just for her, something changed in the way she moved around the house. She no longer hurriedly walked, anticipating needs. She no longer mentally reviewed the family errand list. Every step she took was an act of her own presence, as if she were re-inhabiting her body after years of living on autopilot. She opened the laptop she used only for work and looked up the international scholarship application form. To her surprise, a similar version still existed, open for applications until the end of the month. She read the requirements one by one, trembling, not out of fear of not being selected, but out of the vertigo of even considering it. Suddenly, her life no longer revolved around her father's doctor's schedule or her mother's dietary preferences. It finally revolved around a forgotten question: what did she want? That question plagued her throughout the week. Silently, she began gathering documents, writing cover letters, and updating her resume. She didn't say anything at home, not because she wanted to hide it, but because she no longer needed their approval. It was an intimate, sacred act, a small silent revolution brewing amid emails and forms. At night, while her parents slept, Emily wrote about her experience as a school administrator, about how she dreamed of creating an inclusive education program that would impact vulnerable areas. She wrote with a passion she thought was extinct, and every word she chose was a way to rebuild herself. For the first time in years, the fatigue didn't come from exhaustion, but from enthusiasm. Her inner world, previously relegated to the background, was beginning to expand. In the middle of the month, she received an email that left her motionless for several seconds. She had been shortlisted for a virtual interview with the admissions committee. She felt a mixture of euphoria and panic, as if the universe were forcing her to face her own desire without any further excuses. She spent the following days rehearsing answers in front of the mirror, imagining possible questions, recalling in detail every project she had led at her school. But there was one question she couldn't rehearse. How would she explain to her parents that, after so many years, she was ready to leave? That conversation weighed like a stone in her chest, not out of fear of their reaction, but because it involved finally breaking with a silent loyalty that had kept her trapped. It wasn't a simple move. It was an act of emotional rupture. The night before the interview, Megan showed up, unannounced. She walked in as usual, her voice high and low, complaining about the traffic and the heat, leaving her purse on the floor as if she still lived there. Emily observed her with a new, almost clinical distance. As Megan talked about her plans to open a handmade candle shop with a friend who has connections on Instagram, her parents listened raptly, celebrating every idea. No one asked Emily how her day had been. No one noticed that her eyes were glowing with anxiety. In that moment, she realized that she hadn't just been rendered invisible by her parents, but also by an entire family dynamic that revolved around her sister's charming chaos. And she, who had always been the silent constant, had let that role define her. But that version of herself was doomed. The morning of the interview, Emily woke up before her alarm clock. She dressed in a blue blouse she'd always reserved for important meetings and applied her makeup carefully, as if trying to remind herself that she deserved this moment. She closed her bedroom door and put up a makeshift sign that read, "Do not disturb important meeting." It was symbolic, yes, but also a small boundary she'd never set before. She logged into the video call with her heart pounding, her fingers sweaty and her throat dry. But as soon as they started asking her questions, something in her aligned. She spoke with conviction, with propriety, with a passion that welled up from deep within. Each word was like a brick, reconstructing the image of a woman who no longer asked permission to dream. After the interview ended, she stood in front of the screen for a few minutes, silent. She didn't know if they would accept her, but that wasn't the most important thing anymore. The real achievement was having tried, having allowed herself to think about a life beyond her self-imposed limits. She left the room, her face still tense, and in the kitchen she found her mother and Megan arguing over some new curtains. No. One asked her how it had gone. They didn't even mention the sign on the door. And that was when something inside Emily broke, not with pain, but with determination. She understood that expecting recognition in that place was like asking for water in a desert, and she decided in that instant that she wouldn't wait any longer. That night, as the television cast its flickering light over the living room and her father dozed off on the couch, Emily opened the drawer where she'd found the will, weeks before. She carefully took it out, read it again, not out of doubt but out of a need to reaffirm what she already knew, and placed it on the dining room table, right in the center. Beside it, she left a handwritten sheet of paper with a simple phrase, "Thank you for everything, but I've decided to move on." It wasn't a letter of complaint, nor a cry for help. It was a silent, mature farewell, like everything she'd ever done in her life. That night, she packed a small suitcase, just the bare necessities, documents, a change of clothes, her laptop, and her small pendant with her grandmother's name. The only object she felt was truly hers. The next morning, when her mother came down to the kitchen, she found her already dressed, sitting by her suitcase, sipping her coffee. "Where are you going so early?" she asked in her usual neutral voice. Emily didn't look away. "To start over," she replied. There was no drama, no pleading, no shouting, just a confused mother staring at a daughter who for the first time hadn't asked permission. Megan was still asleep, oblivious to everything. Her father was still upstairs, unaware that this would be the last time Emily would close that door as a resident of that house. As she stepped outside, the morning air seemed fresher than ever. It wasn't freedom yet, but it was the first step toward it. For the first few weeks, Emily settled into a small, furnished apartment near the center. It was a modest place with light-colored walls and a high window that let in the afternoon sun, but it was a new world for her. She didn't have to explain her decisions to anyone, justify her schedule, or hide her tiredness. She learned to live alone differently, not as someone running away, but as someone choosing herself. At first, the silence hit her hard, especially at night, when the echo of the abandonment she felt still filtered through in the form of questions. Am I doing the right thing? What if I'm making a mistake? But every time she made her coffee in a cup of her choice, or hung her clothes where she wanted, she felt those doubts fade a little more. One day, while checking her email, she found the official notification. She had been accepted into the scholarship program. She read the message 3 times before reacting. She didn't scream, she didn't jump. She sat, taking a deep breath, silent tears running down her cheeks. It was the first time something big had happened in her life, without it depending on anyone else. Not on her parents, not on Megan, not on someone else's sacrifice, just on her. That night she lit a candle, a habit she'd started without knowing why, and wrote in her journal a sentence that stuck in her head. "I don't need applause to know I'm doing well." It was simple, but it was hers. With the scholarship confirmed, Emily began preparing for the trip she would take in 3 months. Every day was a mix of excitement and fear, but a fear that no longer paralyzed her, but rather drove her on. She, enrolled in online conversation classes to improve her Spanish, began reading blogs by other women who had emigrated alone, and even dared to buy a new shiny red suitcase as a promise that this time everything would be different. At the same time, she resumed a habit she had had as a teenager, writing short stories. She had forgotten the pleasure of inventing characters, of putting into words what she felt. In one of those texts, without giving it much thought, she described a house without mirrors, where people lived without seeing themselves, and she realized that this place was the exact metaphor for her old life. One Sunday afternoon, she received an unexpected message. It was her mother. It wasn't a call, a letter, or a visit, just a text. "Your father is asking for you. He said he misses your coffees." Emily read it, unsure how to react. There were no apologies, no explanations, just a dry sentence, thrown out like a hook. For a moment, she felt the old temptation to reply, to return, to fill the void with habit. But then she looked at her red suitcase by the door, her passport on the table, and the list of books she still wanted to read. And she understood that missing wasn't the same as changing. She didn't reply, not with anger, not with contempt. She simply decided that her silence was also a form of self-love. In the following days, Emily began to close the cycle. She cancelled old subscriptions, donated clothes that no longer felt like hers, and above all, digitally cleaned up her life, deleting photos, conversations, and contacts that only brought her guilt or hard-to-digest nostalgia. She didn't do it out of resentment, but with a deep need to clear space, like someone airing out a room that's been closed for too long. She rediscovered her laughter on calls with classmates, found pleasure in cooking for just one person without the pressure to please anyone, and allowed herself small luxuries like sleeping in on a random Tuesday. The world wasn't collapsing because she wasn't available to everyone. On the contrary, something inside her was rebuilt with each boundary she learned to set. One afternoon, walking through a local fair, she stopped in front of a used bookstand. A worn copy of Woman at Point Zero caught her eye. She bought it without a second thought and spent hours reading it on a park bench. The author's words, blunt and uncompromising, reminded her of her own path, obedience disguised as loyalty, the weight of inherited silences, the passive violence of not being seen. She closed the book with tears in her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were something else. It was as if, for the first time, someone had written what she had always felt and didn't know how to name. She understood then that her story wasn't a mistake, nor an exaggeration. It was real, and it deserved to be told. The day of the flight arrived faster than she imagined. The red suitcase had been ready the night before, lined up by the door like a declaration of intent. That morning, while waiting for the car that would take her to the airport, Emily received another text. This time, it was from her father. It read simply, "Good luck, daughter. I know you will do great things." It wasn't an apology, it wasn't enough, but it wasn't anything either. She read it several times, searching for a clear emotion in her chest, but all she felt was peace. A warm, mature peace, like the kind that comes when one no longer needs to heal all the wounds to move forward. She put her phone away without answering. There were decisions that weren't discussed, they were lived. On the plane, as the city grew smaller and smaller from the window, Emily closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She wasn't sure what awaited her upon arrival, or if everything would turn out as she'd dreamed. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't care about the outcome. What mattered was the attempt. What mattered was having said yes to a version of herself she had silenced for years. She didn't carry with her great certainties nor promises of success. She carried something more valuable, the conviction that her life would no longer be defined by others, that the love they didn't give her, she was learning to give herself, and that no matter what happened, she would never be invisible again. Months later, Emily was walking down a cobblestone street in Granada, backpack slung over her shoulder and headphones in, heading to her education policy class. The Andalusian accent still seemed musical and indecipherable, but it no longer intimidated her. She had made friends, discovered new flavors, and learned to enjoy her own company. There were difficult days, of course. Not everything was idyllic. Sometimes she missed certain routines, certain familiar voices, but now she knew how to distinguish between healthy nostalgia and paralyzing guilt. Every week she wrote an anonymous column on a blog for expat women, telling pieces of her story with brutal honesty. She did it for herself, but also for all those who, like her, had been taught to take care of everyone but themselves. One afternoon, after finishing a video call with a mentor she deeply admired, Emily looked at her reflection in the window and smiled. She no longer needed wills, family acknowledgements, or borrowed applause. She understood everything without needing to be explained. The inheritance she valued most now wasn't material, but symbolic. It was the right to choose herself, to build from nothing, to start over without apologizing. She closed her laptop, made some cinnamon tea, a taste she'd adopted in her new life, and wrote a single sentence in her diary. "I don't come from a family that taught me to fly, but I learned, and that in the end is what matters."